Shen, early morning session at the Shining Palace, matching Secretary Yaji's poem. Cockcrow, the palace road in cold dawn light. An oriole welcomes spring from the palace wall. Sunrise bell at the golden gate, 1,000 doors thrown open. On jade steps, warrior figures greet officials crowding in. A pattern of swords and pendants. Stars begin to fade. Willows brush with flags and banners, damp with dew. Alone by the Phoenix pool, a guest is singing. With unmatched artistry, an ancient springtime song. So today's poem by Shen is part of a couple of poems. In fact, this one and the next one by Wang Wei are both of them answers to an earlier poem by Jia. So very quickly, let's talk a little bit, even before we talk about Shen, let's talk a little bit about who this Secretary Jia, whose poem is being answered by Shen and whose poem will be answered by Wang Wei tomorrow. Let's talk a little bit about this Jia and the tradition of writing matching poems or harmonizing poems. So Jia was an important member of the court during the An Lushan Rebellion and immediately after the An Lushan Rebellion. He was a scholar official like Shen, like Wang Wei, like Du Fu, like all of these, or most of these poets that are included in this anthology. And one of the, poetry was very important in the Tang court. We've already talked that to become a civil servant, the most prestigious and easier access was through the Jinshi examination, which included a literary part of composition of poetry, which, was the decisive part in that examination. And beyond direct access, any good poet could gain direct access to the emperor by just presenting a poem to the emperor and being rewarded and given office for the presentation, or belonging to the advisory colleges, which were colleges of intellectuals, of scholar officials, who hadn't necessarily passed the examinations. They were named personally by the emperor, both for helping him in polishing the official rescripts and documents, but also for entertaining him. So literary prowess was a way to power, and when scholar officials were in the court, they very frequently dabbled in court rituals, activities that included writing poetry. Now, this was a tradition that came from the past. It especially flourished during the period of disunion, during the Liang dynasty, when literature as an end in itself, became the staple fare for all the officials in the court. And among the literary formalistic games that developed at court, a very common one was harmonizing a poem to another's poem, matching a poem to another's poem. So this worked more or less like this. So the first person composes a poem. He's generally the emperor, or perhaps a high person in his entourage. And then, after this poem is composed, another poet composes a matching poem. Now, the matching can follow different patterns. For example, it can be set to the same subject matter as the first poem, so it will treat the same, it will have generally the same semantic content, but it will change the words. Yeah, just as in a parallelistic couplet inside a poem, the second line matches the first and with a strict parallelism, but this is generally an antithetical parallelism. Like if you've got wind in the first line, you might have rain in the second one in the equivalent place. If you have summer in the first, you might have winter in the second line. In this case, with a matching poem, generally the subject matter, the general semantic content is the same, but the words change. Another possibility is for harmonizing with the rhymes of the original poem. So, for example, the first poem has a certain rhyme scheme, apart from, a metrical pattern, which in this case we might imagine Jiaji's poem would have been a heptasyllabic lushi, and you imitate its rhymes. So you have to use the same rhymes but with different words at the end of the poem. So as you can see, this is a very formalistic literary game that was played at court. So here we might imagine that Shen, who was an important scholar official at this time in the court, has written a poem, probably on the early morning sessions at the Shining Palace. And, they are in an informal context, perhaps banqueting or having fun. And other scholar officials, in this case, Shen in one way at least, write a poem on the same topic. Jiaji, he doesn't have a poem included here, but I think at least 100 or more of his poems have been preserved. He is, as I say, a High Tang, early Middle Tang poet, and well, he probably wasn't very appreciated, or at least appreciated enough to have at least one piece included in this anthology. It would have been interesting to see the original poem that inspires these variations, if you wish, by Shen in one way. Okay, let's move on now to the context of the poem. So this is courtly poetry, which was especially typical in the early Tang period, but it continued all through the dynasty, and in this High Tang poem, just after the Shan rebellion as well. So we get a description of court life. Shen has already given us a poem with a description of court life, if you will remember. There is a poem that we've already read. I don't exactly remember in what section it was. I think it was in the 5-word regulated poem. There's a poem he sent to Left Reminder Du Fu when they were both serving at court in the year 757, after the recovery of the capital by the loyalist forces. And in that poem, you will remember, you had a description of the officials climbing the steps of the imperial palace and going to serve in their different offices. Now here we get a description of another episode. So one of the things that scholar officials did at the beginning of their term of service was attend a morning audience with the emperor. So the palace would open for the scholar officials before dawn. Scholars would line up at the gates, at the external gate of the palace. They would be introduced in a long procession, climbing up the stairs to go to the hall where the audience with the emperor was going to take place. This was a long process of tally checking, of weapons inspection, and so on and so forth. And after all this was over, the courtiers would enter the imperial hall. They would all bow to the emperor. And after this ritual, this ceremony, they would go to their respective offices to serve in the government. And this is what we get described here. There is an early morning session. There's the morning audience with the emperor. Okay, more things. So a little quick reference to the palaces of the Tang dynasty. So there were different imperial palaces in Chang'an. The one that is mentioned here is the Shining Palace, the Daming. So the Tang capital, Chang'an, was actually not built by the Tang. The previous dynasty, the Shui, which didn't last very long, about 50 years or so, which had been the one that had unified China, had started building a new capital, which was called Daxingcheng. And it was, the idealized Chinese capital, with a strict grid pattern, like modern-day areas of New York. There was a big square or rectangle with these perfect grids cutting at 90-degree angles, big avenues. The imperial city, which included the imperial palace and the offices for the administration, was in the north looking south, because this was the traditional position at which the imperial palace was supposed to be in a city, with the emperor in his throne looking south, and all the courtiers and all the citizens and all the city really looking north. There was a big avenue connecting the imperial city with the main gateway at the south entrance of the city. So, as I said, Emperor Shui Wendi started building this capital, which he called Daxingcheng. He started building the palaces, but his dynasty was very short-lived, and in the civil wars at the fall of the Shui, the imperial capital was taken intact by the troops of the first Tang Emperor, Tang Gaozu, which is not that usual. Usually when there is a dynastic change, the capital of the previous dynasty is burnt to the ground. I mean, this is wooden construction, so very little tends to be preserved. But no, in this case, the capital and the palaces that had been built were preserved. So the capital was renamed Chang'an, which had been the name of the capital during the Han Dynasty. It was located in approximately the same place. And the palaces were also renamed, but they were kept. So this first palatial structure was the so-called, during the Tang, Tai Chi Palace. It was located in the north of the city. Now, very early on, during the reign of the second Tang Emperor, Tang Taozong, there was the decision to build another structure. The country was rich and prosperous and consolidated. And one of the problems of the imperial palace, of the Tai Chi Palace, was that it was located in a relatively low area, which meant that it was pretty damp in the summer. So, starting with Tang Taozong, but continuing in the reign of his son, Gaozong, a new palace was built to the northeast of the capital, which was the Great Brightness Palace, or Shining Palace, the Daming. So this would be the main imperial palace and the main residence of emperors until the fall of the dynasty. And that is the palace that is depicted here. Now, that wasn't the only palace. During Xuanzong's reign, Xuanzong, as you know, a very prosperous, successful emperor, other palaces were also built in the east of the city, the Xingqing, and outside of the city, also to the east, in an area of hot springs, the Huaqing Palace, which this last one was very notorious. It appeared, for example, in Bai Juji's The Song of Everlasting Sorrow, because that was the place where the emperor spent most of the time with Jiang Weifei, the favorite consort, the favorite concubine, and where he indulged in pleasures, like getting musicians to compose songs for him in the Pear Garden, himself playing the flute for his dancing concubine. And this was out of the capital, so out of the censorious gaze and criticism of the Confucian scholars. Okay, back to the Ximing Palace. So we already described the ceremony that took place in the morning, and which is going to be described in this poem. Just a short description of how the imperial palace was arranged, so that you get a spatial view of the palace. So Chinese imperial palaces are generally arranged as a combination of courtyards and halls, generally on a north-south axis. And so you have a gate, a courtyard, a hall, another courtyard, another hall, another courtyard, another hall. And the progression is from external to internal. People come from the south, enter the great gateway, pass through the first courtyard, climb the steps, go to the next hall, and so on and so forth. The further away a hall is, the innermost its location, the more private it is. So the first hall is destined for maybe big public ceremonies and affairs. The second hall is slightly more intimate. It's a place where the emperor only brings some of the courtiers and some of the scholar officials. The last hall is meant to be a place of intimacy where it is a great honor to be invited to go there. And generally most people, even scholar officials, never enter. So there's this structure. And this is followed in this palace. I imagine the audience that is being described here would have taken place in the second of the halls. So as you approach the palace as a civil servant, as you reach the end of the avenue that leads to this northeasternly located Great Brilliance Palace, first thing you would have seen is, a massive gate, a gigantic gate, one of the biggest constructions in wood of the world at its time or ever, which would have been the Danfeng Gate, with at least five massive entryways, 5 doorways. This appears in the poem as the Golden Gate in line 3 that we will comment in a minute. The scholar officials would have entered not through the central gate, which was reserved for the emperor, but through the other ones. Then they would have been then in the outer courtyard, a square 630 meters long, with an end in the Han Yuan Hall. So the Han Yuan Hall is the first big construction of the imperial complex, and it's a place where very, very public events would have taken place. The scholar officials wouldn't have gone there, I think. They would have progressed to the second courtyard, the middle court. So the Han Yuan Hall was mainly for state ceremonies like hosting foreign ambassadors during diplomatic exchanges. So the middle court has, you pass through the stairs, you pass the Han Yuan Hall, you would have been in another massive court, and to the north of it, you would have had the Zhuangzhen Hall. Yeah? And this was the place where the morning audience, I imagine, would have taken place. Immediately after the audience, and in the same middle court, the main buildings of the administration were to be found. So the office of the Secretariat was located to the west of the hall. The office of the Chancellery was located to the east. Yeah. So after, having the imperial audience in the Zhuangzhen Hall, the officials in the same court would have gone to their respective working offices. And now beyond this, there would have been an inner court, 95 meters north of the Zhuangzhen Hall, with some government offices, but this inner court, which has as its main pavilion the Zichen Hall, would have been a restricted area, almost a private area for the emperor. It was a great honor to be allowed, to be summoned to the Zichen Hall, so only favored courtiers. And so in this area, in this final inner court, you would have also had around the hall in different pavilions in a big garden space. So the harem, where only the emperor was the only man with a penis who could enter. And you would have had some pleasure palaces also where the emperor could invite other friends and courtiers. You would have had lots of gardens. The Linde Hall, for example, was here, which was a pavilion for banquets and religious rites. Some Taoist temples were also here, the Sanqing Hall, and lots of gardens. In the middle of the garden, there would have been a massive pool, the Taiye Pool, also known as the Penglai Pool, the Phoenix Pool, which is mentioned in line 7 of this poem. And, this was an area of pleasure, of wonderful gardens, with peonies, chrysanthemums, plums, roses, bamboos, almonds, peaches, a wonderful, idyllic space. Okay then, so after this very long introduction, this is going to be a long video. I think I'm going to make another one with a comment of the poem line by line. I'm going to end up now talking a little bit about Shen, and then I'll make another video with the poem itself and the comment line by line. So Shen, we've already encountered him. This is the 5th out of 7 poems that he has in the anthology. And he has a great variety of poems, but the more representative ones are the group of 3 that we read of him. I think it was in the heptasyllabic Juefu section, maybe? The Ancient Ballads? I don't remember right now. Or perhaps it was in the Old Style section of poems. Anyway, you will remember he made some very nice poems about war, about the frontier poetry. It was, I've just found it, in the 5-word Old Style Juefu. He had 3 poems, the Ballad of Running Horse Creek, the Song of Wheel Terrace, the Song of Snow, all of which reflected and talked about military campaigns in the Northwest. So, as I said, Shen is generally equated with Gao Shi. They're the 2 great poets, sometimes with Wang Changling as well. They are supposed to be the best poets for frontier poetry, for describing the war against the barbarians and the alien landscape in the Northwest. Not necessarily always with a negative tone. There's this like for exoticism that is very characteristic of the Tang dynasty, especially when it was at its most successful and at its most receptive of foreign exotica, cultures, and foreign territories. So Gao Shi, he was a scholar official. He passed Jinshi, unlike Gao Shi, who, if you remember, he had to pass a special examination. And in spite of passing the Jinshi, he wasn't posted actually to many civil posts from the beginning. He was given posts in the military. So from very early on, he served in the retinue of military commanders warring in the Northwest for at least 2 extended periods. Yeah. And when he was free from those services, he went back to the capital, and there he mingled with poets who became his friends, like Gao Shi, Wang Wei, Du Fu, other people like this. In fact, you will remember one of the first poems of his, I think the first one of Sun Shen's to appear in the anthology, is a poem in which he describes climbing the pagoda at the Temple of Compassion in the capital with Gao Shi and a Shui Yu. So pretty successful scholar official. Afterwards, he was appointed to several important military postings in his late career after the Anglo-Shan Rebellion. For example, he was a military governor, a Yedushi, of a couple of provinces. And pretty successful, as I said, with some setbacks from time to time, but, you know, an example of a pretty successful scholar official, just like Gao Shi had also been pretty successful. And okay, I think I'm going to leave it at there. In the next video, I'm going to describe each of the lines couplet by couplet and clarify any possible ambiguity.